The envelope Martin shoved across the table was supposed to prove I was marrying for money. Instead, it exposed the one secret they never imagined I already knew. If you had walked into that rehearsal dinner halfway through the evening, you probably would have assumed you were watching another picture-perfect family celebration. The venue overlooked a peaceful lake in northern Vermont, where late summer sunlight shimmered across the water, and every table was decorated with white hydrangeas, polished candles, and framed photographs of Anthony and me from the past 2 years. Soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers while waiters carried trays of crab cakes and sparkling cider between smiling guests. It looked effortless, elegant, and warm. That illusion lasted exactly until my future brother-in-law decided to make me the evening's entertainment. My name is Luna Coleman. I am 31 years old, and I restore historic buildings for a living. Most people hear that and imagine dusty blueprints and old brick walls, but what I really do is preserve stories hidden inside places everyone else has forgotten. I have always believed that if you look carefully enough, every crack has a reason, every repair leaves a trace, and every beautiful surface hides something underneath. I suppose that is why I should have recognized the fractures inside Anthony's family much sooner. Anthony Sanders was 34, and we were supposed to be married the following afternoon. At least, that was the plan everyone believed in. Anthony was the kind of physician who remembered every patient's first name, stayed late without complaining, and apologized when traffic made him 5 minutes late for dinner even though it was never his fault. He never cared about expensive watches or flashy cars. The first time we met, he was wearing faded jeans and helping repaint the community room of an old church that my firm had volunteered to restore. I had no idea his family owned luxury developments across 3 states. He never mentioned it, and honestly, I never asked. I fell in love with the man who spent an hour scraping old paint off wooden window frames because he said shortcuts usually became someone else's problem later. Somewhere along the way, however, his family decided my affection had a price tag. It started quietly. His mother would compliment my dress before casually mentioning one of Anthony's bonuses. His older brother Martin liked asking questions that sounded friendly until you realized every one of them circled back to money. Did I ever think about retiring early? Would I stop working after the wedding? Had I ever signed a prenuptial agreement before? The first few times, I laughed them off because I assumed he was awkward. Eventually I realized he wasn't awkward at all. He was measuring me. Martin Sanders had the kind of confidence that made strangers mistake arrogance for leadership. At 36, he had built a successful real estate company using the Sanders name, tailored suits, and a habit of speaking before anyone else could. He filled every room with certainty whether he was right or not. People listened because he sounded convinced. Unfortunately, sounding convinced and telling the truth are not always the same thing. Throughout dinner, Martin barely acknowledged me except for the occasional smile that never quite reached his eyes. Every time someone congratulated Anthony and me, Martin somehow redirected the conversation toward family legacy, responsibility, or protecting generational wealth. Guests nodded politely while sipping wine, unaware that each comment landed exactly where he intended. Anthony squeezed my hand beneath the table once or twice, silently apologizing without saying a word. That was one of the things I loved about him, but it was also becoming one of the things that worried me. He hated conflict so deeply that he often mistook silence for peace. Across the table, Zachary, retired developer Zachary Sanders, spent most of the evening discussing fly fishing with my uncle, seemingly unaware of the tension building beside him. His mother smiled too quickly whenever conversations drifted toward finances. Every family has invisible rules. The Sanders family had mastered pretending uncomfortable subjects simply did not exist. I had spent enough evenings with them to recognize the pattern. The louder Martin became, the quieter everyone else grew. Dessert had just been served when Martin slowly stood from his chair, lifting his champagne glass with a smile polished enough to fool anyone who did not know him. The room gradually settled into silence, expecting a heartfelt toast to the happy couple. Even I expected another speech about family traditions. Instead, he reached beneath the table and pulled out a large cream-colored envelope sealed with a gold sticker. My stomach tightened, though my expression never changed. He walked toward me deliberately, every step slow enough to draw every eye in the room. The conversations stopped one by one until only the faint sound of water outside remained. Martin placed the envelope directly in front of my dinner plate without asking permission. His smile widened just enough to reveal satisfaction. Then he practically shouted, loud enough for every guest, every server, and every member of both families to hear. He said, "Go ahead, Luna. Sign it, Gold Digger." Every fork froze in midair. Anthony looked from the envelope to his brother, his face draining of color as though he had no idea what was about to happen. I rested one hand lightly on the unopened envelope, looked around the silent room, and took one slow breath before asking a single calm question that made several people suddenly avoid my eyes. "Before I open this," I said, "is everyone here absolutely sure they want the truth to come out tonight?" The silence that followed my question seemed to stretch far beyond the walls of the lakeside ballroom. Martin gave a short laugh the kind people use when they believe they already control the ending. He glanced around at the guests as if inviting them to enjoy the performance with him. "The truth," he said. "The truth is simple. My brother is about to marry someone who should have no problem signing a basic agreement if she is here for the right reasons." A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the room, but nobody joined him. Most of our guests were friends, co-workers, cousins, and neighbors who had come expecting a joyful evening before a wedding, not a public confrontation. I looked toward Anthony. His chair scraped softly against the hardwood floor as he stood. "Martin," he said carefully, "what is this?" "It is a prenuptial agreement," Martin answered before I could speak. "A perfectly reasonable one. Since nobody else seemed willing to protect you, I decided someone had to." Anthony frowned. "You never mentioned this to me." "Because you would have overthought it," Martin replied without hesitation. "You always do." Anthony's expression shifted from confusion to disappointment. He reached for the envelope, but Martin placed a hand on it first. "No," Martin said. "Luna should open it herself." I noticed Frances staring down at her folded napkin instead of looking at anyone. She had not spoken for several minutes. His father finally looked over from the other end of the table, sensing that something had gone very wrong, but he remained seated, watching instead of interrupting. I slowly picked up the envelope. The paper felt heavier than it should have, not because of what was inside, but because of what everyone expected it to represent. I broke the seal without rushing. Several guests shifted in their chairs. Someone quietly set down a glass that had been halfway to their lips. Inside was exactly what Martin claimed. A professionally drafted but unsigned prenuptial proposal with neatly organized pages, signature tabs, and highlighted sections waiting for initials. Attached to the front was a cover letter explaining that the proposal claimed it was intended to protect Anthony's personal assets and any future interests he might receive from the Sanders family from unnecessary financial exposure. My name appeared several times before I had even reached the second page. Martin folded his arms confidently. "Take your time," he said. "We are all family here." I almost smiled at the irony. Family. The word sounded comforting until someone decided to use it as a weapon. I closed the folder and carefully placed it back on the table. "Did you write this?" I asked. "An attorney did," Martin answered. "But yes, I arranged it." "Did Anthony approve it?" Martin hesitated for less than a second. "He understands why it is necessary." Anthony immediately shook his head. "I have never seen that document before tonight." The room became noticeably quieter. Even Martin seemed slightly annoyed that his brother had answered so quickly. "That is only because I wanted to present it in the proper setting," Martin replied. "It saves unnecessary arguments." Anthony looked directly at him. "Humiliating my fiancé in front of everyone we care about is your idea of avoiding an argument?" Nobody answered. A server approached the table carrying fresh coffee before instantly realizing she had walked into something deeply personal. She quietly turned around and disappeared toward the kitchen. I could almost feel every guest wondering whether they should leave or stay frozen where they were. Then came the moment that changed the direction of the evening. Instead of arguing with Martin, I looked around the room and asked a different question. Can everyone hear us clearly? Heads slowly turned toward me. Some nodded almost automatically. A few looked embarrassed. Anthony looked confused. Martin smiled wider, believing I had finally accepted the stage he had built for me. Good, I said calmly. Because if this conversation is public, then every part of it should be public. For the first time that evening, Martin's confidence flickered. Only for an instant, but I noticed it. He had expected anger. He had expected tears. He had expected me to accuse him of insulting me. Calmness was not part of the script he had written. Go ahead, he said. Explain why signing a fair agreement is such a problem. I rested both hands lightly on the table. Actually, I replied, signing it is not the problem. Several people exchanged puzzled looks. Anthony turned toward me. Luna. His voice was gentle, almost asking if I was certain about whatever I planned to do next. I gave him a reassuring glance before speaking again. I am perfectly willing to sign an agreement that both people understand, discuss together, and choose freely. But no fair agreement is introduced for the first time in front of a ballroom full of guests the night before a wedding. I would need independent legal advice, Anthony would need to participate knowingly, and both of us would need enough time to decide. Without humiliation or pressure. That has never frightened me. Martin nodded triumphantly as if he had already won. Then sign it. I will, I answered, after I tell everyone something they deserve to know first. His smile disappeared. Zachary leaned forward slightly. His mother finally looked up from her napkin. Even the musicians in the corner had quietly stopped arranging their equipment, pretending to stay busy while listening. I folded the agreement closed once more and slid it gently across the table, not toward Martin, but toward Anthony. Before anyone decides who I am, I said, they should probably know how your son and I actually met, because it was nothing like the story your family has been telling. Anthony blinked in surprise. Martin let out another dismissive laugh, but this one sounded noticeably less certain than the first. Go ahead, he said. Tell your romantic little story. I held his gaze for a long second before answering in the same calm voice that had unsettled him all evening. It is not the love story that matters, I said quietly. It is the part that happened afterward, and the reason I started paying attention to things that nobody else in this family seemed willing to notice. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The only sound inside the ballroom came from the gentle waves outside brushing against the dock below the windows. I looked around the room before settling my eyes on Anthony. When your brother says I came into your life because of money, I said quietly, he assumes I already knew who you were. Anthony slowly shook his head. You did not. No, I answered. Not even close. I turned toward the guests. 2 years ago, my company volunteered to help restore St. Matthew's Community Church after part of the original structure suffered water damage. It was a small project, mostly supported by volunteers and local donations. One Saturday morning, I was standing on an old ladder trying to document damaged ceiling beams when someone offered to steady it because the floor was uneven. I smiled faintly at the memory. That someone was Anthony. A few guests looked toward him with surprise. Anthony gave an almost embarrassed smile. He introduced himself as Anthony. That was it. No mention of his family. No mention that he was a cardiologist. Definitely no mention that the Sanders family owned luxury developments worth more money than I could even imagine. A quiet laugh rippled through a few tables, easing the tension for only a moment. He spent nearly 6 hours scraping old paint from wooden trim because he said if you skipped preparation, every repair failed sooner than expected. I remember thinking he was unusually patient. Anthony smiled a little wider. You kept correcting the way I held the scraper. Because you were doing it wrong, I answered, and for the first time all evening, a few genuine smiles appeared across the room. Even Zachary let out a soft chuckle. Martin remained expressionless. For months, I continued, our dates were incredibly ordinary. Coffee after work. Walks through public gardens. Volunteer weekends. Local bookstores. We split restaurant bills because neither of us cared who paid. I honestly believed he lived in a modest apartment because he wanted a simpler life. Anthony nodded. I did. Exactly, I replied. Then one evening, almost 8 months after we met, I accidentally learned his last name while someone from the hospital congratulated Dr. Sanders during a charity event. I paused, letting everyone absorb that timeline. I had already fallen in love with him. Several guests quietly exchanged glances. The realization settled over the room differently than any emotional speech could have. I had not chosen Anthony because of wealth. I had chosen him long before I knew wealth had anything to do with his life. Martin folded his arms tighter. A touching story, he said with a dismissive smile. But stories do not change reality. I looked directly at him. No. Facts do. The room grew quiet again. When I finally learned about the Sanders family, I continued, I actually became uncomfortable. Not impressed. Uncomfortable. Because suddenly strangers reacted differently when they heard I was dating Anthony. Some congratulated me before they even knew my name. Others joked about never having to work again. One person even asked whether I had signed a prenuptial agreement before I had met half of Anthony's relatives. Anthony lowered his eyes. He remembered those conversations too. That was when I realized people had already decided who I was. Frances Sanders, finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Luna, why did you never tell us that? I smiled sadly. Because I hoped that if I stayed consistent long enough, people would eventually judge me by my actions instead of their assumptions. Nobody answered. The silence itself became the response. Halfway across the ballroom, one of Anthony's college friends slowly leaned back in his chair, looking less entertained and far more thoughtful than before. Even guests who barely knew me seemed to be reconsidering everything that had happened over the past 10 minutes. Martin broke the silence with a short laugh. Wonderful speech. Truly. But none of that explains why signing a simple agreement suddenly became such a dramatic event. You are right, I answered. It does not. I let that sentence hang in the air before continuing. Because the agreement itself has never been the real issue. His eyebrows narrowed. Then what is? I reached into my handbag, not dramatically, but with the same calm movement I had used all evening. Several people instinctively leaned forward. Anthony looked at me with growing curiosity rather than concern. I removed my phone and placed it on the table without unlocking it. The real issue, I said, started about 6 months ago. Martin's confident posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Most people would not have noticed. I did. As everyone here knows, I continued, my firm specializes in restoring historic properties. That work requires us to review old permits, preservation records, ownership histories, zoning documents, and construction filings. Sometimes we are hired by cities. Sometimes by nonprofit organizations. Sometimes by private owners. Zachary nodded slowly. I remember you explaining that over Thanksgiving. Exactly. I looked toward him. About 6 months ago, one of our consulting projects involved reviewing documentation connected to several redevelopment sites. At first, it was simply another assignment. Routine paperwork. Nothing unusual. I paused. Then I recognized a familiar company name. The room became completely still. Anthony looked from me to Martin and back again. Martin's smile had disappeared entirely. Coincidences happen, he said quickly. They do, I agreed. That is exactly what I thought. I unlocked my phone but kept the screen facing me. So I ignored it. Another pause. Then a second document appeared. Nobody moved. Then a third. Anthony's breathing slowed as though he suddenly sensed where this conversation might be heading. His father sat forward in his chair. His mother gripped her water glass with both hands. Martin spoke before anyone else could. Luna, if you are suggesting something about my business, you should be very careful. I met his eyes without raising my voice. I was careful. His expression hardened. For 6 months, I was careful. I gently rested my thumb against the screen of my phone. And that is exactly why I brought evidence instead of accusations. No one reached for a drink. No one whispered. The ballroom had become so quiet that I could hear the gentle hum of the air conditioning above us. I looked around the room before returning my attention to Anthony. I need everyone to understand something before I say another word, I began. I am not standing here accusing anyone of committing a crime. That is not why I am speaking tonight. I am explaining why I could not simply smile, sign a document, and pretend everything was normal. Anthony slowly nodded, giving me his complete attention. His father remained seated with both hands folded together, while his mother looked increasingly uneasy. Martin, however, crossed his arms again as though he had already decided that confidence alone would carry him through the evening. My firm was hired by a non-profit organization restoring several historic buildings scheduled to be incorporated into a mixed-use redevelopment district, I continued. Projects like that require extensive documentation. We review property histories, preservation approvals, engineering reports, permit applications, and ownership records. Most of the time, it is repetitive work, but accuracy matters because one missing document can delay an entire project. I unlocked my phone and opened a folder containing several saved files. During one review, I noticed that one of the redevelopment companies listed in the supporting documents shared the same name as one of Martin's businesses. Martin gave a dismissive shrug. I own several companies. That proves nothing. I agreed, I replied calmly. That was exactly my first reaction. I looked around the room again. So I kept working. I assumed it was coincidence. Anthony quietly asked, then what changed? A week later another project crossed my desk involving a completely different property nearly 100 miles away. The same company name appeared again. Different address. Different contractors. Similar documentation. Zachary leaned forward slightly. Was that unusual? Not by itself, I answered. Successful companies often appear on multiple developments. What caught my attention was something much smaller. Martin interrupted. Luna, this is becoming ridiculous. I ignored him. Several approval records contained inconsistencies. Dates that did not match supporting correspondence. References to amended permits without attached amendments. Signatures that appeared identical across documents supposedly completed months apart. The room remained silent. I continued carefully. None of those details automatically meant anyone had done anything improper. Administrative mistakes happen every day. That is why I did not jump to conclusions. Anthony's eyes stayed fixed on me. He knew me well enough to recognize that I would never make accusations without verifying every fact I reasonably could. Instead, I said, I requested publicly available records through the normal channels available to consulting firms. Every request followed standard procedure. I compared filing dates, revision histories, and archived planning documents. Martin let out a sharp breath. You investigated my company? No, I answered immediately. I verified project documentation connected to work assigned to my firm. There is an important difference. That distinction seemed to matter to several guests. Zachary gave a slow nod, understanding the professional boundary I was describing. Midway across the ballroom, one of Anthony's cousins quietly whispered something to his wife before both of them fell silent again. Martin tried another approach. Even if you found paperwork errors, businesses deal with paperwork every day. You are trying to make routine issues sound suspicious. I would agree with you, I said, if that had been all I found. For the first time since he had thrown the envelope onto the table, Martin did not respond immediately. It lasted only a second, but the hesitation was unmistakable. I opened another file on my phone. The inconsistencies continued across multiple projects. Every individual issue could have been explained. Together they formed a pattern that deserved clarification. Anthony quietly asked, "Did you ever tell me?" The question carried no accusation, only confusion. I looked directly at him. Yes. His forehead creased. When? Months ago. He stared at me, genuinely unable to remember. 3 weeks ago, after I had finally organized the records into something coherent, I sent a detailed email to the private account you used for our wedding arrangements, personal finances, and scheduling, explaining that I had discovered information I thought you should review before we moved forward with the wedding. I specifically told you I was not making allegations. I simply wanted your opinion because your family's name appeared in documents connected to those projects. I also asked you twice whether you had reviewed the files. Both times you thought I was referring to routine preservation documents because the original messages and attachments were no longer visible in your inbox. I interpreted your distracted answers as a sign that you needed time, not that you had never seen them. Anthony slowly shook his head. Luna. I never received anything like that. My heart sank even though I had expected that answer. I know, I said softly. Anthony looked almost hurt. If I had seen an email like that, I would have called you immediately. I believed him completely. That belief was exactly why I had never confronted him in anger. I had spent months trying to understand why the thoughtful man I loved had apparently ignored something so serious. Tonight, I was finally beginning to understand that perhaps he never had. I tapped another folder on my phone. When you did not respond, I assumed you needed time. So I sent another message a week later. Then another. Eventually I stopped discussing the documents and simply asked if everything was all right. Anthony looked genuinely shaken. Luna, I did not receive any of those either. Across the table, Frances slowly closed her eyes for a brief moment before opening them again. It was a tiny reaction, but it did not escape my notice. Neither did the way Martin suddenly looked away toward the windows instead of meeting my eyes. Anthony followed my gaze until he, too, noticed the change in his brother's expression. Martin, he said quietly, did you know anything about this? Martin answered almost too quickly. Of course not. I did not challenge him immediately. Instead, I opened my email application and turned the screen toward Anthony. Every message remained there, complete with dates, timestamps, attachments, and delivery confirmations. None had bounced back. None had failed to send. They had simply disappeared after arriving. Anthony stared at the screen for several long seconds before lifting his eyes toward his brother with growing disbelief. Then there is only one question left, I said quietly. If every message reached your account, who made sure you never had the chance to read them? The question remained suspended over the room like a weight nobody wanted to touch. Anthony did not look at me anymore. His eyes were fixed entirely on his brother. Answer her, he said quietly. Martin forced a laugh that sounded thinner than anything he had said all evening. You are seriously entertaining this? Luna sends a few emails that get lost, and suddenly I am the villain? Anthony did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned the phone back toward himself and carefully read the timestamps again. 3 separate emails. 3 different dates. Each one marked as successfully delivered. Each one carrying attachments. Each one sent several days apart over the previous 3 weeks. Finally, he looked up. Luna never sends the same message 3 times unless something matters. Hearing him say that brought an unexpected ache to my chest. Even now, beneath the confusion and embarrassment, he still understood who I was. Anthony, Martin replied, email systems make mistakes every day. The account keeps security and activity logs, Anthony answered. If messages were moved or deleted, the provider should be able to show when the changes occurred and which connected account made them. Martin shrugged. Then maybe you should ask them on Monday. His attempt to sound casual only made the room feel more uncomfortable. Zachary slowly stood from his chair for the first time that evening. He did not raise his voice. He simply asked a single question. Anthony, who has access to the private account you use for wedding planning and personal scheduling? Anthony frowned, thinking. Normally only me. He stopped speaking halfway through the sentence. Everyone watched the realization appear across his face. Except. Martin immediately interrupted. Do not overthink this. Anthony ignored him. About 8 months ago, I was struggling to keep my personal calendar, wedding appointments, charity commitments, and family messages synchronized across several devices. He looked toward me, then back at his father. Martin offered to have one of his information technology consultants organize the private account because his company used the same calendar and email platform. Nobody moved. Anthony continued slowly, almost speaking to himself. He helped create automated folders. Priority filters. Calendar synchronization. He looked directly at Martin. You asked for temporary administrative access. Martin folded his arms. Temporary. Anthony's expression hardened. Did you remove it? For the first time all evening, Martin did not answer immediately. Zachary noticed the hesitation as quickly as I did. Martin, he said firmly, did you remove your access? I do not remember, Martin replied. Anthony stared at him in disbelief. You do not remember? It was months ago. Then say yes. I said I do not. Remember. The distinction mattered. Everyone in the room understood why. Anthony reached into his jacket pocket and removed his own phone. He opened several applications before stopping at his email settings. His fingers moved more quickly now, guided by growing concern rather than confusion. After nearly a minute of searching, he quietly whispered, there is still a connected management account with permission to create filters, move messages, and access archived folders. His father's voice became almost inaudible. Who? Anthony swallowed before answering. Martin's consulting account. Several guests gasped softly. Nobody had expected something so simple. There had been no elaborate conspiracy. No unbelievable hacking. Just a level of access that should have been temporary but apparently never ended. Martin immediately lifted both hands. That proves nothing. Administrative access does not mean I read your emails. Anthony nodded slowly. You are right. The access alone does not prove what you did. But it means the account logs can answer the question, and until they do, I need you to stop pretending the possibility is absurd. No, I said calmly. It does not. Everyone looked toward me. I have never claimed that it does. I held Anthony's eyes. That is why I never accused anyone. I only wanted you to know that something was preventing us from having an honest conversation. Anthony lowered himself back into his chair as though the strength had briefly left his legs. Luna. He said softly, you thought I was ignoring you. I nodded. At first. My voice remained steady, but speaking the truth still hurt. Then I started doubting myself. I wondered if maybe I had misunderstood the documents. Maybe you thought I was overreacting. Maybe bringing concerns about your family before the wedding had made you question our relationship. Anthony closed his eyes for a moment. I never had the chance. His words landed far more heavily than anyone else's had that evening. They were not dramatic. They were simply honest. Across the table, Frances quietly wiped away a tear. She had remained silent through almost the entire confrontation, but now her composure was beginning to crack. Anthony noticed. Mom, he asked gently, did you know Martin still had access to my account? She looked down instead of answering. The silence lasted only a few seconds, yet it felt endless. Anthony repeated the question, this time even more softly. Mom? She finally inhaled deeply before speaking. I knew he was helping you organize things. Anthony waited. Did you know he still had access? Another pause. I assumed he probably did. Anthony stared at her. You assumed? She clasped her hands tightly together. He told me he was filtering unnecessary messages because you were overwhelmed with work before the wedding. He said he was protecting you from distractions. No one spoke. Anthony looked slowly from his mother to his brother. Filtering messages, he repeated. His mother nodded faintly. He said he only removed advertisements, promotional emails, and anything that looked unimportant. Anthony's expression changed from confusion to quiet heartbreak. And you believe that? She could not answer. The room no longer felt divided between two families. It felt divided between people who had trusted each other and people who had quietly decided they knew what was best for everyone else. Anthony placed my phone back on the table with extraordinary care, as though even that small movement required deliberate thought. Then he turned toward Martin again. There is one thing I need you to answer truthfully, he said. Did you ever open Luna's emails before I had the chance to see them? Martin looked around the room, searching every face except Anthony's. His composure finally cracked, and he answered before he had time to measure the consequences of his own words. It depends on which email you are talking about. The instant Martin finished speaking, every face in the room changed. It was not a confession, at least not a complete one, but it was enough to erase any remaining belief that this had all been a simple misunderstanding. Anthony stared at his brother as though he were looking at someone he no longer recognized. What does that mean? He asked quietly. Martin immediately realized how his answer had sounded. You are twisting my words, he replied. I meant I occasionally looked at messages that seemed related to scheduling because you asked me to help organize your account. Anthony did not blink. That is not what I asked. Martin spread his hands. You were overwhelmed. I helped. Did I ever ask you to decide which personal emails I should read? Anthony asked. Martin remained silent. His father finally stepped away from his chair and walked toward the center of the room. He was not angry. If anything, he looked deeply disappointed. Martin, he said, bring me a chair. The request caught everyone by surprise. Martin frowned. What? Sit down, his father answered calmly. This conversation is no longer about appearances. It is about facts. Martin reluctantly pulled out a chair and sat across from him. Anthony remained standing beside me. I could feel the tension in his posture, not because he wanted to argue, but because he was trying to process years of trust that suddenly felt uncertain. His father folded his hands together before speaking again. Luna, I want to understand something clearly. Did you ever report your concerns to any government agency or law enforcement office? No, I answered immediately. Did you share your concerns publicly? No. Did you accuse Martin of misconduct to any client? Never. He nodded once. Why not? I looked at Anthony before answering. Because the documents I reviewed raised questions, not conclusions. My responsibility as a professional was to verify information, not invent explanations. I believed Anthony deserved to see everything first because his family's name appeared throughout those projects. Anthony slowly lowered his eyes. His father turned toward him. Did you know any of this? No, Anthony answered honestly. Not one word. His father nodded again before extending his hand toward me. Luna, if you have copies of what you reviewed, would you be willing to let me examine them? Without hesitation, I opened another folder on my phone and removed a slim envelope from my handbag. Inside were printed copies of the publicly available records I had referenced during my review. I handed them to him. Everything here came from official filings, archived planning documents, and publicly accessible records. I highlighted inconsistencies only to make comparison easier. I did not alter anything. He accepted the documents carefully, then sat down and began reading page by page. No one interrupted him. Nearly 2 minutes passed in complete silence except for the occasional sound of paper turning. Halfway through the file, his expression changed. He looked back at an earlier page, then compared it with another. Finally, he spoke without lifting his head. These approval dates do not match. That is correct, I answered. He turned another page. This amendment references an attachment that is missing from the public filing. Yes. Another page. And this contractor identification number changes between revisions while the signature remains identical. That is one of the inconsistencies that concerned me. He continued reading. Anthony watched his father instead of me now. His mother sat motionless, tears quietly collecting in her eyes. Martin attempted to laugh. Dad, paperwork mistakes happen constantly in construction. His father did not argue. He simply looked up and asked, then why have they not been corrected? Martin hesitated. I would have to ask the project managers. Have you? Silence. Have you? His father repeated. No. The answer landed heavily. His father returned to the documents. Luna never said these papers proved wrongdoing, he said slowly. She said they deserved clarification. He looked directly at Martin. Why was your first instinct to humiliate her instead of asking what she had found? Martin leaned back in his chair. Because she was digging through my business before marrying into this family. She reviewed documents connected to projects assigned to her firm, his father corrected. There is a difference. Anthony finally spoke again. Dad. His voice was quieter than before. Do you think she handled this appropriately? His father closed the folder and looked first at me, then at his son. I think she exercised more restraint than most professionals would have. She brought concerns to the person she believed deserved to know. She waited months. She made no public accusations. She came here intending to explain herself only after being publicly accused. His words changed the atmosphere inside the ballroom. Until that moment, many guests had remained uncertain whom to believe. Now the conversation no longer centered on whether I was a gold digger. It centered on why every reasonable attempt to communicate had been blocked. Anthony slowly turned toward his mother. Mom, he asked gently, when Martin told you he was filtering my emails, did you ever ask whether Luna's messages were included? She covered her mouth with trembling fingers before quietly answering, I should have. Anthony nodded sadly. Yes, he whispered. You should have. She began crying softly, not dramatically, but with the unmistakable regret of someone realizing that avoiding conflict had created something much worse. Anthony stepped toward her and rested a hand on her shoulder. I know you thought you were keeping peace, he said. But peace built on silence is not really peace. His father stood again, holding the folder in one hand. He looked at Martin with an expression that carried neither anger nor pride, only disappointment. Tomorrow was supposed to be a celebration, he said. Instead, I need answers about your business, your decisions, and why you believed you had the right to interfere in your brother's relationship. Martin looked around the room, searching for support that was no longer there. Then, after a long pause, he straightened his jacket and quietly said, if everyone wants answers, then there is something about these projects that none of you know yet, and once I explain it, this entire conversation is going to look very different. Every eye in the ballroom shifted back to Martin. For the first time that evening, he no longer looked like a man directing the conversation. He looked like someone trying to regain control of one that had slipped away. He adjusted his jacket, drew a slow breath, and spoke with measured confidence. The redevelopment projects Luna reviewed involved partnerships that were still being negotiated. Some documents were incomplete because revisions were happening in real time. Anyone looking at only part of the record could misunderstand what they were seeing. Zachary listened without interrupting. That is possible, he said evenly. It still does not explain why you interfered with your brother's email. Martin immediately answered, because I knew exactly what would happen if Anthony saw incomplete information without context. He would panic. Luna would panic. The wedding would become a disaster. I was trying to buy time until everything could be explained properly. Anthony stared at him in disbelief. So you decided for me? Martin shrugged slightly. Someone had to make practical decisions. Anthony slowly shook his head. You never even gave me the chance. The words carried no anger. They carried disappointment, and somehow that felt heavier. Martin looked frustrated. You have always been too trusting. You believe the best about everyone. That is one of the reasons I stepped in. Anthony answered quietly, trusting people is not the same as surrendering my judgment. The room remained silent. I watched Anthony carefully. When we first met, he avoided confrontation almost instinctively. Tonight was different. He was not raising his voice or trying to win an argument. He was finally refusing to let someone else speak for him. That mattered more than any dramatic speech could have. Anthony turned toward me. "Luna," he said softly, "I owe you something." I looked into his eyes but said nothing. "For months," he continued, "you probably believed I was ignoring you. You kept trying to reach me while I unknowingly stayed silent. I cannot change that now, but I can tell you this. If I had received even your first message, I would have sat down with you the same day and reviewed every page together." His voice remained calm, yet every word felt genuine. Instead, I left boundaries so weak that someone I trusted found room to stand between us without my knowledge. I could see several guests quietly lowering their eyes. The conversation had stopped being about legal documents. It had become something far more personal. It was about what happened when people allowed others to manage relationships that were never theirs to control. Anthony looked down at the engagement ring still resting on my finger. Several guests followed his gaze, and worried murmurs moved quietly through the ballroom. Martin noticed them too. A faint smile appeared on his face, as though he believed this finally proved his point. "There it is," Martin said. "Reality finally caught up with both of you." Anthony slowly turned toward him. "You think I am ending my engagement?" Martin did not answer directly. "I think people make wiser decisions when emotions settle down." Anthony nodded thoughtfully. "On that point, we actually agree." He looked back at me, not at the ring. "Luna, I am not asking you to take it off because I stopped loving you. But tomorrow was supposed to celebrate a marriage built on trust. Tonight I learned that our trust was damaged long before either of us understood why." His apology was not theatrical. It was quiet, direct, and deeply sincere. I smiled sadly. "You were manipulated too, Anthony." He nodded. "Yes. But I was also responsible for creating a situation where someone else could interfere with our relationship so easily." His father looked at him with unmistakable pride. His mother quietly cried without trying to hide it anymore. Across the room, several guests who had arrived expecting a rehearsal dinner now found themselves witnessing something far more meaningful than a celebration. They were watching two people choose honesty over appearances. Martin, however, looked increasingly impatient. "Are we finished?" he asked. "Because all of this emotion changes nothing. The projects are legitimate. The paperwork will eventually be corrected. Everyone will realize I was protecting this family." Anthony looked directly at him. "No." It was a simple word, but it carried a confidence I had never heard from him before. "You were protecting control, not family." Martin's expression hardened. Anthony continued before he could interrupt. "Family does not mean making decisions for other adults without their knowledge. Family does not mean reading private messages because you think your opinion matters more than theirs. Family certainly does not mean humiliating someone you barely tried to understand." No one objected. Even Martin's usual confidence seemed to fade beneath the weight of those words. Anthony took one slow breath before speaking again. "There is something I need to do before I make any decision about tomorrow." His father asked quietly, "What is that?" Anthony looked first at me, then at the folder of documents still resting in his father's hands. "I need to know whether there is anything else Luna tried to tell me that I never had the chance to hear, because if tonight has taught me anything, it is that the biggest secret may not be inside those project files at all." The question lingered in the room long after Anthony finished speaking. I looked at him for several seconds before slowly unlocking my phone again. "There was one message," I said quietly, "that was different from all the others." Anthony watched me carefully. "Different how?" "It was never about permits or redevelopment files." I scrolled through my sent folder until I found the message. "After weeks without hearing from you, I stopped talking about documents altogether. I decided that if our relationship could not survive one honest conversation, then it was not ready for marriage. Anthony swallowed. I never read that either. No, I answered gently. You did not. I turned the screen toward him. The subject line was simple. It read, "We need to decide together." Anthony silently began reading. The room remained completely still. His eyes moved slowly across the message. I had written that I did not want him to defend me against his family. I did not want him to choose between me and them. I only wanted us to face difficult conversations together instead of allowing silence to make decisions for us. I had also written that if he believed I was wrong, would gladly sit down with him and review every concern page by page. The email ended with one sentence that I had almost forgotten. I trust you enough to tell you the truth, even when I am afraid it may change everything. Anthony reached the end of the message and closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, they were filled not with anger, but with regret. I would have answered this within minutes, he whispered. I know, I replied. That is why I kept waiting. No one spoke. Anthony carefully handed my phone back to me before turning toward his brother. You did not only interfere with emails, he said. You interfered with decisions that belonged to Luna and me. Martin exhaled impatiently. You keep acting as though one mistake erased everything else. Anthony shook his head. No. It was not one mistake. It was months of believing you had the right to manage my life without asking me. Martin opened his mouth to respond, but Anthony calmly lifted a hand. It was the first time I had ever seen him stop his older brother from interrupting. Please let me finish. Martin fell silent. Anthony looked around the ballroom. Everyone here came expecting a rehearsal dinner. Instead, you watched my fiancé defend herself against accusations she never deserved. She remained calm while I stood there confused because someone I trusted had quietly shaped what I saw and what I never saw. His voice remained steady. That responsibility belongs to me now. Anthony reached into the inside pocket of his jacket once more. This time he removed a thin folder that I had not noticed earlier. He walked over to me and placed it gently beside the prenuptial agreement Martin had prepared. What is this? I asked. A draft I asked my attorney to prepare several weeks ago because I wanted us to review it together before authorizing any final wedding payments. I should have shown it to you the moment I received it instead of waiting for what I thought would be the right occasion, he answered. Martin frowned. Another agreement? Anthony nodded. Yes. But not the kind you expected. He opened the folder and turned the first page toward me. It was not a financial contract. It was a written instruction to our vendors, financial coordinator, and wedding planner stating that no remaining payment, schedule change, guest list adjustment, charitable allocation, or vendor decision could be approved unless both Anthony and I agreed in writing. It also revoked every informal authorization previously given to members of his family. Several guests looked surprised. Anthony continued, I drafted this because I realized months ago that too many people had opinions about our wedding. I wanted us to have the freedom to make our own choices. He smiled sadly. Ironically, I never had the chance to show it to you. Martin laughed in disbelief. You are surrendering control? Anthony calmly answered, no. I am sharing it equally with the person I chose to marry. He slid the folder closer to me. Luna, if you still believe there is a future for us after tonight, I want every remaining wedding decision to belong to us, not to anyone else. I looked down at the document without touching it. The room waited. Francis quietly wiped away another tear. His father stood silently beside his chair, saying nothing because he understood that this moment belonged only to us. I slowly lifted the first page and read it carefully. Every clause reflected partnership rather than authority. Nothing required me to give up independence. Nothing placed one person above the other. When I finished reading, I looked back at Anthony. You trust me with all of this? He answered without hesitation. I should have shown you that trust much sooner. I rested my fingertips lightly on the signature line, but I did not pick up the pen lying beside it. A murmur spread quietly through the room. Martin folded his arms again, clearly expecting another rejection. Anthony did not pressure me. He simply waited. I looked at the document for another long moment before gently sliding it back toward him and signed. A few guests gasped softly. Anthony did not look angry. Only curious. "Luna?" he asked. I met his eyes with a calm expression. "This document is built on trust," I said. "That is exactly why I cannot sign it tonight." The silence that followed seemed even deeper than before. Anthony searched my face, trying to understand. I smiled gently and added, "Because before either of us authorizes another decision connected to this wedding, there is one choice we need to make together first." No one spoke after I said I could not sign. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath as every guest waited for an explanation. Anthony did not pressure me. He simply looked at me with the same quiet patience that had first drawn me to him 2 years earlier inside an aging church where neither of us knew what the future would become. "Tell me," he said softly. "What decision comes first?" I smiled, not because the evening had become easier, but because for the first time all night I believed we were finally having the conversation that should have happened months earlier. "I think we should postpone the wedding," I answered. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Frances covered her mouth. Several guests exchanged stunned glances. Martin leaned back in his chair with a satisfied expression, clearly convinced he had been right all along. Anthony, however, never looked away from me. "Postpone?" he asked gently. "Not cancel," I replied. "Postpone." I took a slow breath before continuing. "If we stand in front of our families tomorrow and exchange vows, everyone will applaud a marriage that has not yet had the chance to recover from what happened tonight. We would spend our wedding day pretending everything is settled when both of us know it is not." Anthony listened without interrupting. "I still love you," I continued. "That has not changed. What has changed is that we now understand trust cannot simply be assumed because two people care about each other. It has to be protected together." I glanced around the room. "I do not need you to choose between me and your family. I need you to build healthy boundaries with them because you believe they are necessary, not because I asked you to." Anthony lowered his head for a moment before looking back at me. "How long?" he asked. 3 months, I answered. No wedding planning. No pretending tonight never happened. Just honest conversations, complete transparency, and enough time for both of us to decide whether we are building a marriage or simply rescuing a ceremony. The silence that followed felt different from every silence earlier that evening. Before, silence had been filled with assumptions. Now it was filled with reflection. Anthony looked down at the engagement ring still resting on my finger and then raised his eyes to mine. "Do you still want to wear it?" he asked. I felt tears gathering in my eyes. "Yes," I answered. "Because I am postponing a wedding, not walking away from us." He nodded. "Then I can wait 3 months." He gently covered my hand with his thumb resting beside the ring that had never left my finger, not as a promise that everything had been repaired, but as a promise that we would repair it honestly. A few guests quietly wiped away tears. Anthony turned toward his father. "Dad, I will not be getting married tomorrow." His father nodded with surprising calm. "I understand." Frances slowly stood and walked toward me. For several seconds she struggled to find words. Finally, she said, "I spent so much energy trying to keep everyone comfortable that I stopped asking whether everyone was being treated fairly. I am deeply sorry, Luna." I stepped forward and embraced her gently. "Thank you for saying that," I whispered. "That matters more than you know." She cried quietly, and for the first time all evening, the distance between us began to disappear. Anthony then faced his brother. Martin looked exhausted, defensive, and strangely smaller than when the evening had begun. "I hope," Anthony said calmly, "that whatever questions remain about your business are answered honestly. But regardless of those answers, our relationship cannot continue the way it has. If we are ever going to rebuild trust as brothers, it begins with respecting boundaries you ignored for far too long. Martin did not argue. Perhaps for the first time, he realized that confidence alone could not repair broken trust. 3 months passed more quietly than either of us expected. Anthony removed every outside administrator from his accounts, began attending family counseling sessions with his parents, and insisted that difficult conversations happen openly instead of behind closed doors. The account's activity records later confirmed that Luna's messages had been opened through Martin's consulting profile, moved into a hidden archive, and excluded by a filter created shortly before the first email arrived. Martin could no longer call the situation a misunderstanding. He admitted that he had convinced himself he was protecting Anthony, even though the records showed months of deliberate interference. His father reviewed the redevelopment concerns with independent legal and engineering professionals. The independent review found no basis for the dramatic criminal conclusions some guests had feared, but it did identify undisclosed conflicts of interest, unauthorized procedural shortcuts, and inaccurate filings that required formal correction. Martin was removed from direct control of the affected projects while the company completed its review. Rather than becoming a dramatic public scandal, the situation became an opportunity for accountability, transparency, and meaningful change. Anthony never asked me to ignore what had happened, and I never asked him to abandon his family. Instead, we both learned how to protect our relationship without isolating ourselves from the people we loved. Exactly 3 months after the rehearsal dinner, we returned to the small community church where we first met. There were fewer than 40 guests. No grand ballroom. No elaborate decorations. No speeches about wealth or family legacy. Just close friends, our parents, a few relatives who genuinely supported us, and the quiet sound of bare branches moving against the first cold winds of the coming winter outside the old stained glass windows we had helped restore together years earlier. Zachary attended with a warm smile. His mother hugged me before the ceremony began. Martin was not there. He had chosen to stay away while working through the consequences of his own decisions, and although that absence was noticeable, it no longer defined the day. As Anthony and I exchanged our vows, I realized something had changed in both of us. We were not standing there because our relationship had never been tested. We were standing there because it had been tested honestly, and we had chosen each other without illusions. Closing reflection, perhaps the strongest relationships are not the ones that avoid difficult moments, but the ones that create enough space for truth to be spoken without fear. There are times when love is less about finding perfect agreement and more about having the courage to ask uncomfortable questions before silence grows into distance. This story also reminds us that protecting peace and protecting trust are not always the same thing. Sometimes a conversation that feels difficult today becomes the very reason two people can walk forward with confidence tomorrow. Real closeness often grows when honesty is treated as an act of care instead of conflict. If this story stayed with you, I would truly love to hear your thoughts. If you had been standing where Luna or Anthony stood that evening, what choice would you have made, and what helped you reach that decision?